interesting how he seems to enjoy experiencing the physical realm through, the medium. J.K. Knight, sorry, J.D. Knight. Yeah. So that seems a little bit sus. I know you're familiar with the Joe Fisher story as well.
Only through you.
Okay. Yeah, I'll mention a little bit about it. Yeah, he was a Canadian journalist who became involved in this group. There was a medium, and she was supposedly channeling their spirit guides. So each member of the group had a spirit. She'd go into a full trance, and the entities would speak through her. And Fisher's spirit guide ended up being this young Greek woman named Philippa, and he was, he fell in love with her basically, and he even claims to have had a sexual relationship with this entity, and presumably that took place in a sort of sleep paralysis state, just because people can in fact have sexual encounters with these entities.
Succubi and incubi.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but with Fisher, he found these. Basically, with some of the spirit guides, he looked into their stories to see if they were who they claimed to be, and he did a very thorough investigation, because they told him all these details about their past lives and where they lived, and what their occupations were, and so on. And he discovered that some of the details of their stories were true, but in essence, that they were made up. So it seemed to be the case that these entities were sort of borrowing other people's identities, I suppose, people who had once lived. So Fisher came to the conclusion that these entities were basically hungry ghosts, and they were sort of fixed to the physical realm, and they were experiencing the physical realm through this medium. And anyway, what happened was when he unmasked the group and these entities, he experienced a kind of psychic attack where his navel became very infected, and he could have died because it was a very extreme infection.
His navel?
Yeah, it was like a I forget I forget exactly what type of wound it was, but it was like sometimes the belly button can become infected, like under the skin, and apparently it's a very extreme infection. And Joe Fisher thought this was kind of symbolic. They were attacking the very core of his being, so to speak. And and then it was in 2001, shortly after his book, The Siren Call of Hungry Ghosts, was republished, that he was found dead. He'd supposedly thrown himself off a cliff, and so it seemed to be suicide. And apparently he told his editor, Patrick Hugh, who coincidentally ended up being my publisher for Dark Intrusions, that these spirits that he'd angered as a result of writing the book were still causing him trouble. So possible that he may have been subjected to some kind of psychic attack, because obviously these entities were very angered by the fact that he'd undermined them.
So did he undermine also human beings that these entities were communicating through? Yeah,
well, he also he did. I mean, he confronted everyone in the group and said, this information doesn't check out, and obviously these spirit guides are lying to us, and you shouldn't trust them. But funnily enough, a lot of them defended the spirit guides and said, they were completely convinced that they were genuine, just probably because they wanted to believe it, because they liked the idea of being able to communicate with their spirit guide.
So then they turned against him.
I don't think so. He doesn't mention anything like that. I don't think they felt really, threatened. But certainly the entities, and I guess it's possible that someone in the group murdered him. I don't know.
Well, I
That's
was
one
thinking of an in-between thing of somebody in the group was actually collaborating with these entities as a sorcerer with his allies and was able to actually direct that energy, the entities, against Fisher. Then I'm sure the entities would have been happy to oblige, seeing as Fisher was jeopardizing their food source.
Exactly. Yeah, it's interesting how you referred to them as a food source, and yeah, they seem to be vampiric beings. They were sort of feeding off all this energy that was generated. Yeah, so that's why Fisher refers to them as hungry ghosts, because they're sort of vampires, I suppose.
Well, hungry ghost isn't it a term from Buddhism, or an Eastern term specifically?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I mean the Tibetan Buddhists talk about hungry ghosts, and they make offerings to these beings. They make offerings to all sentient beings. They, sometimes, like I lived at a Buddhist center for a number of years, so anyway, they'll, sometimes burn pine leaves, pine needles, and, supposedly the entities feed off the smoke, or they'll make heaps of food, and then they'll just put it outside in the garden, and you're not supposed to touch it, of course, and, then these entities somehow consume the food. I guess I don't quite, it's an offering. It's
the subtler essence of it, I think.
Yeah.
Etheric essence of the food. But I wonder if there's an overlap there with entities that are non-human and never have been human and just exist on a different plane, but still need some sort of food source that is non-physical or non-inorganic, which would overlap with castanators, the flyers, and any number of other kind of esoteric descriptions of succubi and whatnot. On one hand, you have that, but there's also the idea that, as you've talked about earlier, that sometimes when a person dies, they leave this astral shell behind, or there is left behind, whatever isn't recycled. If it's still somehow attached to the Earth plane, then it haunts that plane, and it's like this. That those have also been described as hungry ghosts, because they're basically stuck on the Earth plane by a sort of craving, that they were so attached to physical pleasures and physical needs while they're alive that they've kind of generated this astral entity, if you will, that becomes sort of semi-autonomous, and that is basically constantly looking for energy. So, for example, this Dr. Sagan has written about this book called Entities, which describes how entities are behind many addictions. Like a person has this addiction for whatever it is, sex or alcohol, what have you. There's an entity attached to them that is actually vicariously getting this experience through them, and driving them and compelling them to constantly seek out whatever it is, this experience, this sensation, so that that entity can feed off that experience vicariously.
Yeah, I'm sort of familiar with that concept. You're saying that these astral shells are, shells, so they're dead, basically.
Lifeless, yeah.
Lifeless, okay, and they're trying to sustain their existence by
and I
feeding
think
off
that
the living.
it would be a matter of sort of magnetism. I don't think they'd necessarily be trying to do anything or really be autonomous. They would appear autonomous because that they've got a certain degree of form and hence independence, but they would just be drawn to whatever that energy that they needed to sustain themselves as separate entities, and they would be feeding off it. As long as that energy source was there, they would be attached to it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's a good theory too. I was just thinking as well about thought forms and how some of those I know it was Dion Fortune, the British occultist. She describes in one of her books how she managed to generate this thought form of a wolf because
Mm.
she was sort of on the edge of sleep, and she was harboring negative thoughts about this person. It was kind of an accident. This wolf sort of appeared, and she was worried that it would take on a life of its own, and so she had to reabsorb this entity back into herself.
Mm.
And I can see how if thought forms exist, then if they become independent of the person who created them, then they might try and sustain their existence by feeding off the living as well. So, yeah.
Well, there's a lot of rich areas of inquiry here. I want to go back maybe to what you were saying
Yeah.
about these channeled entities and what Fisher discovered, that their stories didn't add up, and the possibilities that the likelihood even that these entities were assembling
Mm.
uh, a, a sort of persona
Yeah.
or being based on the components that they could gather from the psyches of the people that they were uh, interacting with.
Yeah.
So then, um, I mean, you could imagine if these entities have access to our unconscious, both as individuals and collectively, then
Yeah.
they've basically got an endless source of information that they can use to cobble together
Yeah.
an appearance of being something. So it would be quite feasible for an entity that was sufficiently thorough and efficient
Mm.
to create the semblance of being a 6,000-year-old Murian warrior, or an
Yeah.
ancient Egyptian pharaoh,
Mm.
or an archangel,
Yeah.
Uh, any number of possibilities that would feed in to the channeler's consciousness directly in terms of providing what that person wanted,
Yeah.
what was going to appeal to them,
Mm.
and what was going to most satisfy their own ego and their own sense of self-importance. And
Yeah.
by doing that, um, it would then secure a line into that person's psyche
Mm.
and be able to feed off them, because it would be, the more it was giving this bogus information that it was actually taking from the person's unconscious to begin with, reshaping it, repackaging it in a form that made it seem new and exciting,
Mm.
the more that person would actually open to a communication with that entity, and the more that person would give of their own energy and life force to it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I don't know if you're familiar. Oh, well, you would be. Emanuel Swedenborg. He talks about these. Well, spirits and demons and things like that. He said that they work through the unconscious, or they inhabit the unconscious mind. So I was just thinking how when these entities communicate through a medium, they have access to that person's unconscious. So that I can see how they might be able to draw on the sort of universal unconscious, I suppose. I don't know, you call it the Akashic records or whatever. And the collective unconscious.
Or even the genetic material, what's contained in the DNA.
Yeah.
Um, Physically, that is totally inaccessible to us, the DNA, the information in there. Scientists can take it in the laboratory and compare it and decode it. But in terms of actually sticking a knife in our leg and pulling a piece out so we can remember our childhood or our ancestors'
Hmm.
history, we don't know how to do that. But in the astral realm, so-called, then maybe it's a whole different thing. Hence, we've got this idea of Akashic records. Maybe that's just a fancy new